Your turn.
The opening words are from Lawrence of Arabia. Everyone dreams, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their mind wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous people, for they may act on their dreams with open eyes to make them possible. The opening hymn is number 40, The Morning Hangs a Signal.
And please stay standing for our unison affirmation, which can be found on the inside of your order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. So be it. Good morning. It is so good to see everybody, and you're not actually sleeping in this morning miraculously. Enough, you're right here. You don't have a pillow pulled over your head and covering your ears. You are among friends. What an accomplishment and a joy and perhaps a relief. I don't know. If you are visiting for the first time, we're so very glad and we're lucky that you have come. Welcome. We are a congregation gathered in spirit, justice, and community. We celebrate the many diversities among us: age, race, class, religious background, differing abilities, family structures, sexualities, gender expression. Welcome no matter where you were born or your immigration status. Welcome no matter what is working or not working in your life. Following the service, everyone is invited to Community Hour, which you can find through the doors behind me. And you could stop by the welcome table and find out a little bit more information about everything that's going on here and tell us about you. You can also look for somebody with a red welcoming mug, and that's somebody on the membership committee who's hopeful of connecting to you, but we want to just not inundate you, let you find that person and connect with them. But it's also great to be here in this room. I know some people have brought their family members and friends, and some people are just wondering what to do on that long Thanksgiving holiday. So in a moment, but not yet, we're going to turn and greet your neighbor and find someone that you don't know yet, but that's not quite yet. Let's see. You could also fill out a little blue connection card if you would like to stay in touch. They're in your pews. If you're a kid who's visiting today or here as you usually are, there aren't religious education classes this week, but there are fun activities happening downstairs right now as we speak. And I know that Caitlin has volunteered to, she's right here, volunteered to walk downstairs and show anyone who'd like to find out where that is happening. There's a nursery that is there if you have a baby who's in need of care. We are so very lucky to have our own Doug Mooder leading the service today, and Patrick Oates is helping out as well. And the two of them will be here to host a service discussion upstairs in the Bacon Room at 11:30 following the service for some good old-fashioned fun. And you can always find announcements in the back of your order of service, so have a look there. So let's take that moment to greet somebody new, say hi to an old friend, and just extend the radical welcome we love so much here. Want to play a little something? We are going to sing, this is hymn number 138, These Things Shall Be. forgot one announcement. There is a blood pressure clinic monthly around here, and it is happening today. It's in my office, back through these doors, the middle office, and you could go and have your blood pressure checked. That can always be good following Thanksgiving.
Doug's sermon today is about two kinds of faith, foundational and visionary. We have three readings to start us thinking about them. Your foundational faith is just what it sounds like, the things which seem so certain that you can build the rest of your worldview on that foundation. In the West, the most iconic story of a search for a firm foundation is that of Descartes, which he told in a discourse on method published in 1637. Because I wished to give myself entirely to the search after truth, I thought that it was necessary for me to reject as absolutely false everything to which I could imagine the least ground of doubt, in order to see if afterwards there remained anything in my belief that was entirely certain. Thus, because our senses sometimes deceive us, I wish to suppose that nothing is just as they cause us to imagine them to be. And because there are men who deceive themselves in their reasoning, and judging that I was as subject to error as any other, I rejected as false all the reasons formerly accepted by me as demonstrations. And since all the same thoughts and conceptions which we have while awake may also come to us in sleep, without any of them being at that time true, I resolved to assume that everything that ever entered into my mind was no more true than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately afterwards, I noticed that whilst I thus wished to think all things false, it was absolutely essential that the I who thought this should be somewhat, and remarking that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions brought forward by the skeptics were incapable of shaking it, I came to the conclusion that I could receive it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy for which I was seeking.
That was foundational faith. Visionary faith has more to do with leaps of faith, those moments when people defy common sense and do things that appear highly impractical, because their attention is fixed not on their experience of the way the world is, but on their vision of how it could be. This reading is from William James' The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902. In the previous chapter, James had identified a state he called saintliness and listed the saintly virtues that go with it. But here he considers whether it's possible to be too saintly. We must frankly confess then, using our empirical common sense and ordinary practical prejudices, that in the world that actually is, the virtues of sympathy, charity, and non-resistance may be and often have been manifested in excess. The powers of darkness have systematically taken advantage of them. The whole modern scientific organization of charity is a consequence of the failure of simply giving alms. The whole history of constitutional government is a commentary on the excellence of resisting evil, and when one cheek is smitten, of smiting back and not turning the other one also. You will agree to this in general. For in spite of the gospel, in spite of Quakerism, in spite of Tolstoy, you believe in fighting fire with fire, in shooting down usurpers, locking up thieves, and freezing out vagabonds and swindlers. And yet, you are sure, as I am sure, that were the world confined to these hard-headed, hard-hearted, and hard-fisted methods exclusively, were there no one prompt to help a brother first and find out afterwards whether he were worthy, no one willing to drown his private wrongs in pity for the wronger's person, no one ready to be duped many a time rather than live always on suspicion, No one glad to treat individuals passionately and impulsively rather than by general rules of prudence, the world would be an infinitely worse place than it is now to live in. The tender grace not of a day that is dead, but of a day yet to be born somehow, with the golden rule grown natural, would be cut off from the perspective of our imaginations.
The musical, 1776, is about John Adams' eventual successful effort to convince the Continental Congress to declare independence. The song, Is Anybody There?, happens at a low point in that process, when Adams is feeling very much alone. After everyone else has gone home, he stands in the dark in what today we would call Independence Hall. Ideally, I would sing this to you, but we all have to deal with our limitations. The croakers all say we'll rue the day. There'll be hell to pay in fiery purgatory. Through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. Is anybody there? Does anybody care? Does anybody see what I see? I see fireworks. I see the pageant and pomp and parade. I hear the bells ringing out. I hear the cannons roar. I see Americans, all Americans, free forevermore. How quiet the chamber is. How silent the chamber is. Is anybody there? Does anybody care? Does anybody see what I see?
This church is something that we all do together, and none of us could keep it going on our own. None of us by ourselves could do all the work or cover all the expenses or simply pay attention to all the things that need attention in the course of a typical week. That's why the offering is an act of faith. If no one else gave their time and talent and money to First Parish, if it was just you, then your contributions would be pointless. So whenever you contribute to First Parish in any way at all, you are expressing your faith in the rest of us. Faith that you won't be the only one. As you contribute, so others will contribute. And together, we keep First Parish going. We'll now collect the morning's offering. almost got up about 3 times there. Faith is something Unitarian Universalisms are deeply ambivalent about. On the one hand, we sometimes envy people who remain serene and steady when we are plagued by doubt. We may admire people whose faith motivates them to keep going and ultimately succeed in situations where common sense would have told them to give up. And yet, we also recognize that faith sometimes makes people certain of things that are not true. It can justify oppression, block the progress of science, start wars, and inspire terrorism. On a much smaller scale, faith can cause people to make nuisances of themselves by walking up to total strangers and asking them if they're saved. I know that some of you don't like to call Unitarian Universalism a faith. Faith, we sometimes think, is an irrational thing that other people do. We just believe reasonable things supported by good evidence. So how can that be faith? I also understand that it can feel a little threatening to see someone stand in a pulpit and proclaim his faith. Because faith is commonly thought of as a private road to truth. Through faith, I might claim to know things that apply not just to me, but to you also. And to know them through a means that you can't check. You can't look at my evidence or follow my logic, because evidence and logic are not how I know these things if I know them by faith. And being completely certain of these truths that apply to you, I might be tempted to impose them on you for your own good, through institutional power if I have it, or by law, or maybe even by force. So I understand why people of faith can be scary. But what I'd like to do this morning is rehabilitate faith somewhat by telling you about 2 kinds of faith that I find in myself, and explaining how it is possible to frame them in ways that allow them to guide my own life, but don't tempt me to impose them on other people. The key in each case is to let go of the vision of faith as a private road to universal truth, or a personal connection to the mind of God, and instead to see it more humbly as a way of finding my own path. Foundational faith, as illustrated by that Descartes reading that Patrick did, is that sense of certainty that you might feel about a few core beliefs that you build your worldview around. Descartes' story of how he came to be certain of his first principle is still being told almost 400 years after the fact. And I think that's because we can still identify with the problem he was facing. Today, maybe more than ever, our minds are full of clutter. Stuff our parents and teachers told us when we were too young to know any better. Stereotypes of race and class and gender that society has imprinted on us. A sense of neediness and incompleteness that advertisers have induced us to feel so that we will buy their products. And incalculable numbers of other things that may or may not be facts. Maybe we can't even remember where we heard them or why we first thought that they might be true. And so, what Descartes says he did still makes a good fantasy. What if you just blew it all away, doubted everything, and didn't believe anything again until you found some good reason? It's like the fantasy where you take everything out of your house and only bring stuff back as you actually need it. The clothes that don't fit anymore, the wedding presents you never took out of the box, the broken stuff you never get around to fixing, it's all just gone, and you live surrounded only by the things that you actually want. Now, another piece of the fantasy is that when Descartes does blow everything away, it doesn't turn out the way we're afraid it would. He doesn't keep sinking deeper and deeper into a bottomless quicksand of doubt. He doesn't wind up as a nihilist, believing that nothing is true or that nothing is ever really right or wrong. Instead, he fairly quickly hit bedrock. I am thinking, he says, and finds himself unable to doubt this. So I must exist, he concludes, and starts building upward from there. And he builds at a speed that seems incredible to a modern reader. Within a few pages, he is equally certain of the existence of the soul, the benevolence of God, and all kinds of other things that leave me scratching my head. But even so, his story suggests an idea that still appeals. Maybe if you started shoveling all the clutter out of your mind, before long, you'd reach bedrock truths that are too solid to doubt. Now, in Descartes' day and in the Enlightenment era that followed a century later, those chunks of intellectual bedrock were known as self-evident truth. And philosophers explained them like this. Each human soul contains a tiny sliver of the divine omniscience, just enough for us to see certain truths immediately without evidence or deduction. And the examples they usually pointed to were the postulates of geometry. But in case some of you would rather not remember a high school math class this morning, I have a simpler example. What if I handed you a jar of marbles and asked you how many marbles were in it? You could count them, and when you got done, you might or might not be confident that you had the right answer. But if I handed you 3 marbles, you wouldn't count them. You wouldn't say 1, 2, 3. You'd just look at them and perceive immediately that there were 3, with no conscious process whatsoever. You'd be absolutely certain. Some things are like that. They're so simple and clear that you don't have to gather evidence or go through some reasoning process. You just see immediately that they're true. Because all the evidence you need is in the thing itself. It's self-evident. Now, if the phrase self-evident truth rings a bell, it's because you've heard it before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Jefferson is actually making a very audacious claim there. He's saying, I'm not going to argue with you about this. I'm not going to gather evidence to convince you because you shouldn't need convincing. If you just hold in your head the thought that all men are created equal, you should just see that it's true. You'll see it the way you saw those 3 marbles. It's self-evident. The problem, and this turns out to be a problem with self-evident truth in general, is that not everybody did see it. There were some people who found it self-evident that somebody has to be on top. And to others, it was self-evident that George III would never have become king in the first place if God didn't want it that way. Some people jumped to the conclusion that African men are created equal too, which apparently was not at all what Jefferson meant. And so that vision of the Enlightenment, that those little slivers of divine omniscience would lead us all to see the same building block truths, that vision failed. Worse, it failed in a way that provoked envy and competition. Because if I can see self-evident truths that are not self-evident to you, that must mean that the sliver of God in my soul is bigger than the sliver of God in your soul. So it's not surprising that wars would be fought over claims like that. Now that's how things stood for about another century. And then the pragmatic philosopher Charles Peirce came up with an insight that flipped everything upside down. Instead of self-evident truths, Peirce left truth out of it entirely and just talked about indubitable propositions. In other words, he agrees that if you try Descartes' exercise of doubting everything, eventually you will fail as he failed. You'll find something you can't doubt. But where Descartes would say that you have found truth, Peirce says something more modest. What you have learned is not something about the universe, but something about yourself. You have found the limits of your doubt. So where Descartes or Jefferson would have seen an achievement of faith, Peirce sees a failure of doubt. And when you flip the framing that way, it starts to make sense that different people's doubts would fail in different places. And in fact, they do. For example, when Buddhists try to reproduce Descartes' experiment, they get a different result. Rather than getting to I am thinking and concluding, therefore I must exist, Buddhists get to thinking is happening. And they find themselves unable to deduce anything about a thinker from that. Once you've found something you can't doubt, Peirce, like Descartes, would advise you to start building on it, but for a humbler reason. If you can't doubt some idea, you might as well accept it and work with it, because what else are you going to do? You can't doubt it, so you might as well use it. So how does that apply to me? One of the things I believe is that love and compassion lead to a more satisfying and meaningful way of life than hate and cruelty. Now, I could give you reasons and evidence for that, but when I'm being totally honest with myself, I have to admit that I don't believe it because of reasons and evidence. I believe it because I just do. I doubt there is any new argument or fact that someone could show me that would convince me that hate and cruelty produce a better life. I believe in love and compassion because I'm just not able to doubt it. Now, my failure of doubt doesn't mean that I have arrived at some universal truth that I should impose on everyone else for their own good. But it does mean that I have found at least one foundational stone for my personal faith. I might as well build on it, because what else am I going to do? I seem to be stuck with it. Two things change when I start thinking about faith that way. One is that I have more empathy with people who have a different faith, because I can imagine having my doubt fail in a different place. Some people look at the world and say, there has to be a point to all this. It can't just all be meaningless chaos. And I can doubt that, but I can also imagine not doubting it. Some people at various points in their lives have had moments of insight and clarity hit them with such force that they are unable to doubt that those moments are important. A skeptic might say these so-called religious experiences are just fortuitous configurations of neurotransmitters in your brain. But often the people who have had these kinds of experiences can't go there. Because if this experience, strong as it was, didn't mean anything, then what does? And if that experience or those collections of experiences are connected with a holy place or a religious ritual or a sacred text or a great teacher, then they're not able to doubt that those things are special. Understanding what the failure of doubt feels like, I can cut them some slack for that. A second change is that I hold my foundational faith with more humility and recognize that it might change as my life unfolds. Like any other faculty, doubt can grow weaker or stronger. So from time to time, I need to revisit those foundation stones of my personal faith to see if I still find them undoubtable. Maybe the next time I look, I'll find that they are shaped a little differently than I had thought. Now, the second kind of faith I want to tell you about is visionary faith. Visionary faith is what motivates people to make efforts beyond what common sense can justify. Visionaries go to more trouble, take bigger risks, and keep trying even after it seems obvious that they're going to fail. They do that because they're not just looking at the world as it is. They're also seeing a vision of a world that could be. The content of that vision might be anything from world peace to 2 kids in a white picket fence. But whatever it is, it beckons to you. It draws a commitment out of you that goes far beyond anything that a cost-benefit calculation can justify. All the historic movements for change that Unitarians admire were driven by this kind of visionary faith. Abolition, women's suffrage, the labor movement, civil rights, women's equality, gay rights, and so on. People put themselves out in ways that didn't strictly make sense. And if they hadn't, as William James pointed out, the world would be an infinitely worse place than it is now to live in. Those among us who continue to work for a better world, who are trying, say, to preserve democracy against the current wave of authoritarianism, or protect the biosphere from climate change, or complete the revolutions of women's rights or civil rights, I think we do have a certain amount of we hold these truths to be self-evident in us. But if we introspect deeply, I think most of us would also end up admitting that our foundational faith doesn't take us all the way there. At some point, you have to see that vision of a better world and feel the pull of it. That's what makes worthwhile all the effort and inconvenience and sacrifice. But visionary faith can also be toxic. The Nazis were visionaries, but that didn't make their visions good. In America today, many in the alt-right are driven by a vision of a white ethno-state. Christian dominionists envision church and state united into a single, all-powerful institution, imposing on everyone the will of their God. So while a lot of good comes from visionary faith, not all visionary faith is good. Like foundational faith, it needs to be held with a certain humility. A key thing to understand, if you're going to maintain that humility, is that visionary faith is fundamentally different than foundational faith, in that it's not about truth and certainty, it's about love and risk. A vision has gotten into your head, and no one can promise you that that vision is good or true, but nonetheless, you have fallen in love with it to the point that you are willing to make sacrifices to bring your vision into reality. That's how the 1776 musical portrays John Adams. In those lyrics that Patrick read you, he's not giving reasons for American independence. He's presenting a vision of the new nation and saying, if you could see this, you would love it the way that I do. When William James talks about what he calls the saintly virtues, he is almost apologetic about how much he loves them. I know the world doesn't work this way, he tells us, but it could. And having envisioned a world with the golden rule grown natural, don't you love it? Isn't it worth risking a little imprudence and foolishness? But the fact that you love a vision does not guarantee that it will come to pass, or even that anyone else will see it, no matter how hard you try to show it to them. It won't necessarily happen just because you love it, and you can't wish it into fruition just by loving it more. If it does come true, it may not come true for you or in your lifetime. That also is the lesson of abolition and unionization and civil rights. Many runaway slaves were recaptured. Strikes were broken. Like many civil rights pioneers before him, Martin Luther King was murdered. He climbed to the mountaintop and saw the promised land, but he did not get to go there. Love is not about certainty. It is about risk. It is about moving forward without guarantees. Loving a vision doesn't mean that you know it will happen. It means that you are willing to risk it not happening. You are willing to risk being wrong, being laughed at, seeing all your effort come to nothing. To love, Salman Rushdie wrote, is to risk your life. Sometimes that is literally true, as it was for Dr. King. But it is almost always true in at least a figurative way. Love doesn't make us indestructible. Quite the opposite. It is the people and things and visions that we love that make us vulnerable. Now, at this point, I imagine that a question might pop into the mind of any person of good practical common sense. And that question would be, why do it? Why let yourself fall in love with a vision of how the world could be? And if you find such a feeling rising up inside you, why indulge it? Why accept the risks? Why make the sacrifices? Why let all that impracticality and foolishness and vulnerability into your life? And my answer is simple. Love lights life up. A life that is full of love and full of the commitments that love calls on a person to make is fuller, deeper, and richer than any other kind of life. Now, why do I believe that? Well, if I'm being honest with myself, I have to admit that it's not because of reasons and evidence. I believe it because I just do. I can imagine that other people would doubt it. I can even imagine doubting it myself. But I can't actually doubt it. Love lights life up. I don't know if that's a universal truth, but it's a belief that I seem to be stuck with. So I might as well build on it. The closing hymn is number 287, Faith of Larger Liberty. Closing words are from Eleanor Roosevelt. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams.